Assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. You know, this week was full of big oofs. Not for me necessarily, but for some companies out there in general. So first off, we got the good old Zuck with a big oof getting banned from the US government and their devices, specifically WhatsApp. We got Cisco having to patch multiple perfect score 10 out of 10 CVEs for remote code execution. And we got the death of the blue screen of death on Windows and it going the way of the dodo bird. So we got a lot of big oofs to talk about this week. So hopefully it's not too much of a Debbie Downer of an episode. But yeah, lots of sad stories. But before we get into that, let's start off with our trivia question for the week. So what was Amazon's original company name? So before they were called Amazon, what were they called? And that is your trivia question for the week. So before we get into our cybersecurity tip, let's get into the Zuck story, because this does have a little bit of a cybersecurity element to it. So, the United States House has banned WhatsApp on all official devices over security and data protection issues. So, the U.S. House of Representatives has formally banned congressional staff and staff members from using WhatsApp on government-issued devices, citing security concerns. The decision, according to the House Chief Administrative Officer, was motivated by worries about the app's security. The Chief Administration Officer said, quote, "The Office of Cybersecurity has deemed WhatsApp a high risk to users due to the lack of transparency in how it protects user data, absence of stored data encryption, and potential security risks involving its use." End quote. Now, you know it's bad when I am going to try to defend the Zuck, because if you've listened to the podcast long enough, you know I am not a fan of the Zuck. And I personally don't use WhatsApp, and I don't have any plans to. And I try to limit the uses of the other Zuck apps that I have been not forced into using, but happen to have. So I don't like being the defender of meta here. But at least according to them, now again, take them at their word. I guess take it with a pinch of salt. They do claim that WhatsApp is completely end-to-end encrypted. So technically speaking, there shouldn't be any sort of privacy concerns or data storage concerns with WhatsApp, because hypothetically speaking, everything should be encrypted anyway from end to end, meaning that even though your messages might be passing through Meta's servers, it's all encrypted, so they can't read it anyway. The only person that would be able to read your message is you and the person you sent it to. So theoretically, there should not be any user privacy concerns or encryption concerns or anything like that. Now, again, this is also the Zuck we're talking about and Meta, and we all know that they love to harvest some data. So who's to say that there isn't some key somewhere stored in the Meta servers that can decrypt everything, and basically a master key, if you will, decrypt everything and harvest that data so the Zuck can harvest even more of that tasty data. Now, in that case, then you absolutely have a valid concern. But as much as I would like to get on the bandwagon of that conspiracy theory, unfortunately, there really isn't any evidence alluding to that in any way. I mean, again, really the only um, sources we have is Meta themselves saying as such for this app, because it's not like it's an open source app, so it's not like you can inspect the source code and see actually what's going on. So you do have to take them at their word. But at the same time, like I said, there's not really any evidence to suggest that they do have some sort of master key backdoor to basically read every message that you're sending on WhatsApp. Now, I guess you could also say that it's a valid concern that could be something they would do given Meta's general practices when it comes to data privacy and user privacy. But again, we do have to acknowledge the fact that there's not like there's any data to support the fact that Meta is actually harvesting user data and has some kind of master key. Now, for what it's worth, though, I do think the government is at least on to something in the sense that they are telling employees, well, I guess now they're mandating employees not have WhatsApp on their phone, government issued phones anyway. But I think that's just like common sense. I mean, I don't care if you're a government employee or you're an employee at some other private industry company. If you get a device from that company, whether it's a cell phone, a laptop, a desktop, tablet, whatever the case is, do not put any kind of personal apps on that device. Do not use it for personal reasons, because at the end of the day, that is not your device. It is owned and managed by the organization that you work for. In this case, it's the federal government. And yeah, I don't think you necessarily want to be messing with the federal government and potentially doing private things on their own hosted devices, because the government, like Meta, also likes to kind of harvest user data and have advocated in the past for reducing the strength of encryption. Now, maybe not necessarily as much the United States government, but specifically the EU. There have been multiple cases there where they've been essentially trying to remove end-to-end encryption so they can add their own backdoors in there for safety reasons, I guess, which, as we've stated on the podcast before, because the back door doesn't work. I mean, yes, it allows you to, get access to things that you otherwise shouldn't have, but the back door is not just for you. It's for anyone that can find it and knows how to use it. And a perfect example of this is about a year ago when it was discovered that I believe it was allegedly a Chinese sponsored hacking group essentially got themselves into the US telecom network, and the way they got through it and were able to listen on things was through the back door that like law enforcement had put into the cellular network. So as you can see, backdoors are never a good idea, and we've talked about this plenty of times. But again, the point is that you shouldn't be doing anything personal on any sort of government issued device or any sort of device that's issued to you from the company or organization that you work for. Now, the only potential use case I could see from, anyone, whether you're a corporate employee, whether you work for the government or what have you, the only use case I can realistically see for using an app like WhatsApp on your device issued by either the government, your company, or whatever, is if you have clients or customers or whatever that you work with that need to communicate with you through that avenue, which I'm not sure who would be included in that. I mean, I guess if you're trying to work with, like, if you're in the government and you have like sources from some other country, maybe WhatsApp is the means of communication you'd use. But aside from like those very niche use cases, I really don't see any kind of use of why you would need to use WhatsApp on your phone. Now, I guess that does go without saying that it's not like the government is necessarily super afraid of using third-party messaging services, because apparently that's the new thing to do these days. I think we all remember the whole Signal incident that happened a few months ago. But the thing is, if you're talking with government people, the government has their own forms of communication, like internally, that you should be using. You shouldn't be using third-party messaging apps to message your government buddies to do whatever you're talking about. You should just be using the internal tools that you have available. The only reason you should be using third-party tools is if you're, maybe coordinating something with someone that doesn't have access to your internal tools. But again, I'm not entirely sure why you would be using WhatsApp for that. So, I mean, personally, I don't necessarily agree per se that it should be completely banned, but at the same time, I don't necessarily think that you should be having it on a government device anyway. But I mean, I guess it goes back to that thing of just because. I guess it's the whole, because you told me I can't do something, I don't like it. Like, I wasn't going to do it anyway, but because you told me that I can't do it, now I don't like the fact that I can't do it. Even though I had no intention on doing it anyway. So yeah, that was the story. Rip the Zuck. I'm sure if he does harvest data from WhatsApp, he's probably going to be very sad to see at least the House of Representatives congressional staff go, and not being able to harvest any more of their data. And now we take off the tinfoil hat. So now with that, let's get into this week's cybersecurity tip. So, how many times has this been a cybersecurity tip? Patch your Cisco systems and validate user input. I don't know how many times we're going to have to beat this dead horse, but we apparently have to keep beating it because Cisco has apparently not learned. And to be honest, I do have an honest question. What is going on with Cisco? Because Cisco is, at least they were, this like premier dominant leader in the networking space. They were basically the gold standard when it came to networking equipment in the enterprise. Like, if you wanted the top of the line, best of the best networking gear for your business, for your data center, whatever, you were going with Cisco. Cisco has their own certifications. They have the CCNA. It's like a big thing. If you can get the CCNA, you can basically get a job anywhere in networking. It's widely respected. But it seems like it seems like we're at the point now where it's like every other month or so, Cisco is patching some 10 out of 10 CVE because of remote code execution issues. And that's again what we have this week, where there's two CVEs. There are patches available, but the CVE, so the first one is CVE 2025-20218. Which is an unauthenticated remote code execution vulnerability affecting Cisco ISE and ISE PIC releases 3.3 and later, that could allow an unauthenticated remote attacker to execute arbitrary code on the underlying operating system as root. So basically as bad as it gets. And then we have the second one, which is CVE 2025-20282, which basically this one is very similar. It's an unauthenticated remote code execution vulnerability affecting Cisco ISE and ISE PIC releases 3.4, and allows an unauthenticated remote attacker to upload arbitrary files to an affected device and execute those files on the underlying operating system as root. So, congratulations, Cisco. Way to go. Not adequately putting proper, I guess, validation checks in your code and allowing remote code execution as root. That is a job well done. So the first one, the first CVE is basically the result of insufficient validation of user requests. So basically, an attacker could exploit the API by sending a malformed API request, and then that would give them the elevated privileges to run whatever commands they want as root. And then the second one is very similar. They basically upload a malicious file, and due to bad validation checks, the file gets uploaded and gets placed in privileged directories. And come on, guys. I mean, this is secure coding 101. Like, if you I don't know, like, I don't even think you need any sort of background minor certificate or anything like that in cybersecurity to know that you don't trust user input. It doesn't matter if it's a file, it doesn't matter if it's an API request, it doesn't matter if it's a command line injection, it doesn't matter what the user is giving you. You always, always, always assume it is malicious until you have validated for a fact that it is not. And if you don't do that, you get exactly what happened here with Cisco, and you get 10 out of 10 CVEs, remote code execution as root, and you're in for a very, very bad day. Now, thankfully, at least according to the reports, there is no reports of either of these vulnerabilities being exploited in the wild. So I guess that's a good thing. But then again, it kind of goes without saying, these CVEs score a perfect 10, which means they're as bad as they get because, again, it's remote code execution as root. So if you have any of these Cisco devices, you better be making sure that you update them ASAP. So, yeah, I guess moral of the story here for this week's cybersecurity tip is update your Cisco systems and always remember to never trust user input and always make sure to validate it before you actually do anything with it. And that is your cybersecurity tip for the week. Now, moving right along, let's get into what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week. So this week was a pretty small week in terms of nerdy things, but I did have a minor update this week to my Pokemon game that I'm working on. Nothing too major, but I did get the code in place to allow you to swap items in your bag. Specifically, if you have like obviously you can't swap like between pockets in the bag, but within a given pocket you can swap items around. So I got the underlying code for that working, got some test cases written, and it all seems to be working. I do still need to actually get the implementation of it done. So the actual like GUI part of it in the actual bag menu, and mapping the controls on the keyboard to actually initiate a swap and then actually perform the swap. So that still needs to be done, but at least the underlying code is there and in place and working. So that is definitely a good thing. And I have to say, it was very nice to get back into the Pokemon code and start writing. Even though it wasn't much, it was nice to get in there. Now, one thing that was quite funny, which is why you test things, by the way, is when I was testing the code and writing my test cases, I was noticing the swap was always failing, and I was a little confused by this. And then I realized I made a dumb mistake, and rather than doing the traditional swap method of you take the first element, put in a temporary variable, set the second element to the first element, and then the second element to the temporary variable. That last step of setting the second element to the temporary variable, yeah, I was just setting the first element to the temporary variable, essentially undoing the swap. Well, not really undoing the swap, but making a duplicate. So when I would try to check to see if the swap was successful, it would always fail because I wasn't actually performing the full swap. So rookie mistake there. Thankfully, it didn't take me too long to identify that one. It wasn't one of those where I banged my head against the wall for a few hours on, so that was definitely a good thing. because there have been instances where there have been very silly, dumb mistakes like that I have spent way too long trying to troubleshoot because I'm focusing on other areas and not missing the very obvious and noticeable easy thing to check because I'm like, oh, there's no way I could have messed up that very basic thing. But as evident here, I very much can. But thankfully, like I said, it was a pretty quick fix and I found it pretty quickly. The old debug print statements did the charm there. Well, actually, I take that back. No, they really didn't. They were just kind of giving me the idea of where it was failing because I didn't have any print statements because I was so confident that everything was just going to work. And I noticed it was failing, and I was like, okay, that's weird. So then I started throwing some print statements in there to see where it was failing, and I noticed it was failing right off the bat, and I was like, huh, that's interesting. Well, actually, the first reason it was failing was because the bounds check was failing because I didn't realize that the number I was giving it to swap didn't actually exist. So for instance, I think in the test case there was like four elements in the bag, and I was trying to swap like with the fifth element or something like that, so it was out of bounds. So it was just always returning false because it was invalid. So that was actually doing what it was supposed to, not what I was expecting, but what it was supposed to. But then as I started, going through the print statements, I noticed like after the first swap attempt, it was still failing. And I was like, huh, that's weird. And then that's where I noticed, oh, I'm doing index one and index one twice and setting it equal to the same thing. Ah, I see what's going on here. So, so yeah, it was very rookie mistake, but I am glad that I found it relatively quickly. So yeah, that was what the nerdy things I got up to this week. And the next story, I guess, that we have to talk about is the blue screen of death going the way of the dodo bird. So it turns out that Microsoft is indeed getting rid of the blue screen of death, which is very, very sad. It was honestly one of the few joys left in using Windows. Now, obviously, no one likes when their computer crashes. It can, especially when it happens at a very inconvenient time. But at least if your Windows computer crashed and you got the blue screen of death, you would at least see that frowny face pop up and be like, something went wrong, and you're like, oh. Now, I guess depending on the context, that could be very aggravating. But the blue screen of death was just fun, and heck, I even wrote my own dummy driver to trigger a blue screen of death on demand just because blue screens of death are fun. But apparently, I won't be able to do that anymore. Well, technically, it will still happen. But you won't actually get the blue screen of death. I think they're making it like a black screen or something like that. Very boring, very uninspired. And one of the last few good things about Windows is just dying apparently. And I think part of, well, actually, this is just pure speculation on my part, but I'm wondering if part of the reason they're getting rid of it was with the whole CrowdStrike blowing up the internet last year and basically taking down every single Windows computer that existed with a forever blue screen of death. Might have left some bad tastes in people's mouths for the blue screen of death. So I don't know if that has anything to do with it. It might have given the blue screen of death a bad rap potentially. Which that I guess that could potentially be a reason for the change. Since Microsoft is also reportedly trying to get antivirus out of the kernel space as well to potentially and hopefully avoid future CrowdStrike incidents. So, in case in case you're confused, basically what that means when we're talking about kernel space is CrowdStrike. Well, I guess to back up, how the CrowdStrike crash occurred and worked. If you didn't remember back from when we covered it in our episode, I guess like about a year ago or so. Essentially, what was going on was CrowdStrike was running with kernel level permissions. It was running in the kernel space. So when you're talking about where an application runs, it can either run in one of two places. It either runs in the kernel space or it runs in user space. User space has a lot more restrictions on things. So if you ever write any of your own programs, it's going to be running in user space. And the thing with user space is if you ever like request something from like the file system, or you request some kind of network connection or anything like that, requesting memory, in order to make those things happen, you basically have to cause an interrupt, which then switches the back to control back to the operating system to perform whatever system call you were trying to make, whether that was requesting memory, requesting to read from a file, requesting to access the network card to do like some kind of networking, whatever the case may be. And then the operating system would go do that task and then return the result back to you, and then your program would continue executing. But if your program runs in kernel space, you're running in that privileged level where the operating system runs, which that's typically where drivers tend to live because they need that direct access to the hardware, which only the kernel space can provide you. Um, but the catch is with kernel space is if something goes wrong in kernel space, the way that the kernel protects itself is just completely shutting itself down as like a safeguard kill switch essentially. So, unlike in your program that's running in user space, if you go out of bounds on an array, your program's probably just going to crash because the operating system detected that you're trying to access memory you shouldn't and just kills your program. And it's basically the same thing that goes on in kernel space, except the problem is the kernel is the one that gets killed, but the kernel is also in charge of running the entire operating system, in which case causes the entire operating system to crash because the kernel died. So that was basically what was going on with CrowdStrike. They had like some file they were trying to access, which was basically all zeros, and they were trying to pull data from it, but because it was null, they were running into exceptions and causing the driver to crash, which because it was running in kernel space, it caused Windows to crash, which then caused the blue screen of death. And because CrowdStrike loads perpetually and is basically required for boot, you were basically stuck in an infinite Windows blue screen of death unless you basically went into like safe mode and like manually deleted the file. And yeah, it was a whole ordeal. So pour one out, I guess, for all of the sysadmins that basically had to work an entire weekend to fix all of the Windows computers out there that were in an inevitable and a permanent blue screen of death situation. So that is one nice thing with Windows getting antivirus out of the kernel space, is it prevents things like this from happening in the future. So I do have to give Microsoft a little bit of credit there because that is something that they did, which I think is actually a pretty smart move on their part, because the less things you have in the kernel space, the better, because kernel space is basically even worse than root privileges, because root just basically kind of gives you access to everything user space wise, but kernel level basically gives you access to full control over everything hardware related, which is obviously not a very, very good thing. So I guess props to you, Microsoft, for getting antivirus out of the kernel space, but shame on you, Microsoft, for killing the blue screen of death. And to quickly wrap up the episode, since I know we are very under on time on this episode for once rather than over on time. A few months ago, I guess, we kind of did like a frequently asked question type thing. And there was one question that we didn't get to, which I figured since we have some extra time in this episode, we might as well cover, which is basically in general, what is, a good process or my process for problem solving when it comes to code. And to give the classic computer science answer, it depends. Because the first thing I tried to identify is if this is a problem I have encountered before and know the solution to, because that's pretty much your first go-to is there, because inevitably you're going to run into errors that you've experienced before over and over again. It's just how it goes. A very common one is an index out of bounds error. You tried to index into an array and you were, over the bounds of it. That's a pretty easy solution. It's a pretty easy problem to fix. Everyone's done it. Even the most senior engineers will hit that bug from time to time. But the nice thing about it is because it's such a common issue, it's very easy to fix, and it's probably one of those where your program will crash. You'll look at the what the output is, what the error is, and you'll be like, oh, I know exactly what happened there, and then you can go in and quickly fix it and move on with your day. But if it's a more complex bug, that's where things kind of start to get a little bit interesting. So, depending on what the bug is specifically, typically what I'll do is try to have some sort of logging or debugging going on around where the program is experiencing the issue. Whether that's, throwing in log statements if I'm using some kind of logger functionality, whether that's throwing in the good old print statement, the old reliable, or just throwing the program through a debugger. One of those three is generally the process I'll go. If I'm using a debugger, I can obviously set breakpoints at places and kind of inspect what's going on. And basically the whole point of that is to check the status of, what certain variables are, what am I expecting them to be, things like that. And obviously throwing in a debugger will be generally easier since you don't have to worry about printing everything out. You can just kind of have that information in the debugger. But then it kind of also, so that's generally the approach for a more complex bug. Um, but if you're talking about something that like I haven't implemented yet, it kind of depends on like the scope of things. So I guess take a step back here. So that was like solving like bugs you experience. Now, if you're, I guess, kind of shifting gears here a little bit, for problems that you are trying to solve that aren't like a bug that you're experiencing, like it's a problem that you haven't solved before. So if it's something that I have never implemented before, generally what I'll try to do is try to analyze the scope of the problem. So if it's a relatively small thing I'm trying to implement, like a good example would be swapping the items in the bag in an individual pocket. Now, granted, that is a problem I've solved before, obviously in different contexts, but the purpose is basically the same. You have a temporary variable that you set one of the elements to. The element that you set to the temporary variable, you set it to the second one, and then you use the temporary variable to set the third. I know that probably makes absolutely no sense since there's no visual, so I apologize. But the thing to remember when you're swapping things is you have the two elements you're trying to swap, and then you have the temporary variable that you store one of those two in, so then you can actually perform the swap. So that is obviously is a problem that I've solved before. So if it's something like along those lines or something, I'll just kind of like crank out the code to do it. But if it's a smaller problem that I haven't solved before, generally my approach is also to just try to crank out some code to do it because um, generally I found that especially for smaller problems, trying to come up with a solution, writing it down, whiteboarding it, making diagrams, things like that is generally a waste of time. Like, sure, it might help you like banging your head against the wall in code, but what I've found is like the amount of time that you spend collectively is generally about the same. Now, sure, you might not have as much annoyance when you're actually writing the code since you kind of planned it out for the most part. But again, you still have all that planning that you did initially, which is kind of offset by the headbanging, I guess. Um, so so that's usually what I'll try to do. I'll try to kind of get some boilerplate code going and then start writing some test cases for the code to test it to make sure it's performing like I think it should. And then when I run into issues, modify the code as necessary, write additional test cases, things like that, and just continuing to iterate and tweak things kind of as I go until the solution is actually doing what it's supposed to. Now, if it's a more complex problem that potentially requires multiple classes or functions to implement, that's where I'll generally try to actually jot down some notes because usually with those big complex problems, that's not necessarily something that you can crank out in a coding session. Now, I guess it depends on how long your coding sessions are. If you can afford to spend hours straight, then maybe you can knock it all out or at least get most of it knocked out. But if you're a very busy person or if this is a side project of yours, chances are you're not really going to have the time to crank out a few different classes with multiple functions all working together in harmony to solve your complex problem in the allotted time you have that you're working on this side project. Now, if it's your full time day job, you probably have more time, but again, there's things like meetings that come up that you might have to go to and kind of takes you away from the code for a bit. And the reason why in those cases I think having at least some kind of notes or design is important is because it helps you kind of at least capture your ideas. So then when you do step away and come back to it, you kind of at least have a point of reference of what you were thinking about when you're trying to implement this solution. So for instance, for my Pokemon project that I'm working on, I basically have a note document that I basically just jot down all the features that I currently want to try to implement. So then, well, the other nice thing I guess for that too is if you have like a list of those things, you can kind of keep track of what you've accomplished, what you have yet to accomplish, and kind of uh, it removes the I guess the roadblock that you run into, especially when working on a personal project of okay, well what do I do now? Because that's honestly one of the biggest hurdles that I've noticed running into when trying to work on personal projects is when I've accomplished the thing that I wanted to accomplish. If I don't identify the next thing I want to work on, usually that's a roadblock for me because then I'll sit down, to try to code something and then I spend like a good chunk of the time initially being like, okay, so what do I actually want to do now? Because I got that working. So what other features do I want to implement? I don't necessarily have a ton of time, so I don't want to sink my teeth into something really big. So and then I spend most of the time thinking about it, and by the time I come up with something, I don't really have time to actually do it. So that is one nice thing about like jotting your ideas down is whether it's, you maybe just took a walk, you just took a shower, you were making food, whatever, and an idea pops into your head of how you can either implement something or an idea for a feature or something like that. Jot it down, write it down, so then when you actually get into your coding session, you can actually look at your notes and kind of, remember back to what you were thinking about and kind of hit the ground running in that sense. And it's especially helpful for more complex problems because, like I said, you kind of have that point of reference that you can kind of lean on, and it's also nice too because sometimes those ideas for how to solve problems hit you at the most inopportune moments, i.e., when you're not at your computer and can actually act on them. I've had that happen many times. So just kind of being able to write them down and kind of capture what your thoughts are, and then you can kind of go back and reference them later is definitely very helpful. But also just especially when we're talking about having a more complex problem with potentially multiple classes and functions, I'll I might not create like a full blown like use case diagram or class diagram or anything like that. But I will at least kind of jot down some ideas of what I think the classes should do potentially, like what kind of functionality they should have to at least kind of give me some ideas of what I need to work on. Because what I found is if I just have the general problem I'm trying to solve and just try to go right into the code and solve it, I'll get along the way in like writing code, and then I'll basically turn into an AI and hallucinate a function that doesn't exist. I'm making a joke here, but essentially like what'll happen is I'll be writing code, we're having these classes work together, and I'll be like, oh yeah, I need to access that variable. Let me go look at the method for it, and then I'll go scroll through the source code and be like, oh yeah, I forgot to actually write that functionality, so then I'll have to go back in, write the functionality, then go back to what I was doing. And that can sometimes be a massive tangent in and of itself because oftentimes, depending on how complex things get, what I found, and I had this happen in my Pokemon game too, is I'll find a problem in one class, and then I'll fix that, but then that kind of reveals a problem in a different class. Then I go and fix that, and the next thing I know, I'm in a class that has absolutely nothing to do with the original problem I was trying to solve. Yet through a cascading effect of things calling each other, it somehow managed to get over here, and yeah, so having at least kind of a general sense of what you want your classes to do and stuff is definitely worthwhile, even if you're not like writing full blown, like, UML diagrams and all that nonsense. But personally, I'm experienced enough to know at this point that no matter how much you plan things out, you're always going to hit snags and roadblocks that you didn't expect. So that's why I'm generally not the biggest fan of planning everything out to a T before you start coding. Now, I know that basically goes against every single like computer science class that you probably took, especially in college, where they're like, you have to create a requirements document and a design document to lay everything out, yada, yada, yada. And I mean, if you have absolutely nothing, sure, that stuff can be beneficial to you. But if you already kind of know what you're trying to make and you're just trying to add additional features and functionality, it's kind of a waste of time. I mean, it's not a complete waste of time because documentation is always a good thing. But the issue, I guess, with documentation sometimes, well, I guess if we're being honest, most of the time does not actually reflect reality because we're pretty terrible at actually updating our documentation, which kind of goes back to the point of whenever you're implementing code based on like documentation, you're always going to hit snags and roadblocks, in which case you make your tweaks to actually make the code work. You don't update the documentation, and then someone comes along later, reads the documentation, realize it doesn't match the code, and then there's confusion. So sometimes I guess you could argue that the documentation just makes things more confusing. Now I'm not necessarily full on in that camp, but I that's one reason why I'm a big fan of like self-documenting documentation. So things like JavaDoc and Doxygen documentation, because basically all you have to do is write comments in your code about what functions and classes do, and then the documentation automatically gets generated for you. So anytime you make a tweak to a comment or to a function declaration or anything like that, your documentation gets updated, which is very nice. You don't have to worry about manually going in and updating things because that is just a hassle that you do not want to deal with, which I think is why most people just don't deal with it. So that is kind of one of the gripes with, having heavily going through and creating design documents and requirements documents, because don't get me wrong, that stuff is important in helping to guide and direct you as you implement the code. But there will come a point where the code base does not reflect at least the design document anymore. Now, it theoretically should still meet the requirements document because, I mean, that's literally just stating what the code should do. The design document is where it gets a little more hairy because the design document is just how someone pictured that the system would work, not necessarily the right way it should work or how it will actually work, but just how they kind of thought it up. But the requirements document is at least still a general good source of truth of what the software should do. But again, that's very high level and abstract and doesn't really tell you much in how the code actually operates, which is where the design document comes in. But again, as we mentioned, they tend to get out of sync pretty quickly, which is why, for me personally, like for the Pokemon game I'm writing, I putting in as much Doxygen documentation as I can. And I do the same thing with some of the Swift programs I write, since Apple has their own thing. I think it's called DocC, I think is what it's called. Very similar. It basically auto documents all your code for you and can generate, nice documentation for your code packages, which is very, very nice. So just kind of having that as my source of truth and reference material is very beneficial, because I don't have to worry about it being out of date, because literally every time I push code changes to my GitLab server, a fresh copy of the Doxygen documentation gets generated and published in my home lab, so I can easily just go to the link and reference it anytime I want to if I don't feel like spelunking through code. So yeah, that's basically kind of the main way I kind of try to approach complex problems. Is it's really, depending on the complexity level, of course, but probably jot down at least some general notes about how I want to go about solving the problem, and then going from there. Because that is, I guess, one thing about design documents too, is there you can get to different levels of granularity with them. So some design documents will get to the point where they're like down to the letter, like basically writing pseudocode for how something should operate. I don't necessarily like to go that fine tuned, but maybe some like general higher level thinking. Like, for instance, in the Pokemon game I'm working on, one thing that I potentially want to have down the line is some sort of networking based capabilities. I haven't fully decided on what that all will entail, but in my notes document that I talked about, um, where I just kind of throw in ideas of things that I want to implement, I do have like an entire section dedicated to that topic idea. And I basically have like uh, a section of bullets basically documenting out the general flow of how I envision it'll work. Now, I don't have classes in there, I don't have actual function names or anything like that, but it's a very just generalized what the protocol will kind of look like for how data should be shared, and what the client will reach out with, what the server will respond with, how the server will act internally, things like that, just at a very, very high level. And then based off that, I can then go in when I actually, when I actually get to implementing that, can go in and make the code changes as necessary. But yeah, so the real thing with when you get to a very complex problem, I just like to at least kind of brainstorm out some ideas and kind of jot them down, just so I kind of have them, and then kind of use those to go off of as I kind of hack away at code. Now, is that the best practice? Maybe it is, maybe it's not, but it's what's been working for me for the past, how long have I been coding for? A little over 10 years now. So it's been working for me. So that's kind of what I've been sticking with. Maybe it doesn't work for you, and that's totally okay too. But that's just kind of at least my approach for things when it comes to solving problems in code. So with that, let's finish up this episode with our trivia question for the week. So Amazon was not originally called Amazon. That was not their original company name. So what was Amazon's original company name before they became Amazon? If you said Cadabra, congratulations, you got this week's trivia question correct. And if you enjoyed this week's episode, definitely be sure to leave it a rating and review and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And if you have any questions, topics, or ideas about this episode or future episodes, definitely be sure to leave a comment down below if you're on YouTube, or you can shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, full nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.